graders, how are we today? Good, good. Well, I'm excited because today we're going to be reading a story about a family of ducklings. I know, it's so exciting. So, in this story, this is the mama duckling. Her name is Mrs. Mallard, and she has a bunch of baby ducklings. And then there's also a Mr. Mallard. He's not shown in this picture, but he's the dad. So, how many ducklings do they have? Should we count together? Okay, ready? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 ducklings. Now, do we think that's all of them? Maybe there's more. Maybe they're not all shown on this picture because Mr. Mallard's not shown in this picture. So maybe some ducklings are also missing from this picture. Does anyone want to take any predictions of what might happen in this story? That's a good one. Okay, anyone else? Yeah, okay, all good predictions, guys. I love it. Thank you for sharing. So those things might happen, they might not. Let's take a look. Let's keep reading on. So this book is called Make Way for Ducklings, and it is written and illustrated by Robert McCloskey. So he wrote the book and he drew the pictures in here. All right, Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were looking for a place to live. But every time Mr. Mallard saw what looked like a nice place, Mrs. Mallard said it was no good. There were sure to be foxes in the woods or turtles in the water, and she was not going to raise a family where there might be foxes or turtles. So they flew on and on. So that's Mr. and Mrs. Mallard up there. When they got to Boston, they felt too tired to fly any further. There was a nice pond in the public garden with a little island on it. The very place to spend the night, quacked Mr. Mallard. So they flapped down. They're flapping down to this island right here. Next morning, they fished for their breakfast in the mud at the bottom of the pond, but they didn't find much. Look at them bobbing under their water. That's so cute. And everyone, they're in a big city, it looks like, right? Just as they were getting ready to start on their way, an enormous bird came by. It was pushing a boat full of people, and there was a man sitting on the back. Good morning, quacked Mr. Mallard, being polite. The big bird was too proud to answer, but the people on the boat threw peanuts into the water. So the Mallards followed them all around the pond and got another breakfast, better than the first. Look at how fun that is. All the people are riding on this boat, and the big bird, is pedaling them from the back. I like this place, said Mrs. Mallard as they climbed out on the bank and waddled along. Why don't we build a nest and raise our ducklings right in this pond? There are no foxes and no turtles, and the people feed us peanuts. What could be better? Good, said Mr. Mallard, delighted that at last Mrs. Mallard had found a place that suited her. But, look out, squawked Mrs. Mallard all of the dither. You'll get run over. And when she got her breath, she added, This is no place for babies with all those horrid things rushing about. We'll have to look somewhere else. So what happened? Yes, a biker came by and almost ran them over. That's scary. Imagine if you're as small as a little duck and this huge human comes by on a bike whizzing past you and you want to raise a family? Not there. Too busy. Too many bikers. That's crazy. So they flew over Beacon Hill and round the State House, but there was no place there. That doesn't look like a great place to raise a family of ducklings, does it? There's buildings everywhere, there's people everywhere. It looks too busy. They need a quiet place. What else do they need? Water. That's a good idea. Yep. So they can get their food. Nice. They looked in the Lewisburg Square, but there was no water to swim in. Then they flew over the Charles River. This is better, quacked Mr. Mallard. That island looks like a quiet place, and it's only a little away from the public garden. Yes, said Mrs. Mallard, remembering the peanuts. That looks just the right place to hatch my ducklings. So they chose a cozy spot among the bushes near the water and settled down to build their nest. And only just in time, for now they were beginning to molt. Does anyone know what molting means? Yeah, they were losing all their feathers. So all the old ones drop out and new ones come in. That's a good vocabulary word, molt. Can everyone say that after me? Molt. Good. All their old wing feathers started to drop out, and they would not be able to fly again until the new ones grew in. But of course, they could swim, and one day they swam over to the park on River Bank, where they met a policeman named Michael. Michael fed them the peanuts, and after that, the mallards called on Michael every day. So this is Michael right here, and what is he again? Yeah, he's a policeman. Good listening. After Mrs. Mallard had laid 8 eggs in the nest, she couldn't go to visit Michael anymore because she had to sit on the eggs to keep them warm. So, like a lot of birds, after they have their eggs, the mama has to sit on them until they hatch, right? Because if they get too cold, they're not going to hatch. So she's got to stay on them. So she only leaves to get water or to get like a little bit of food, but she's really got to stay on these as long as she can. She moved off the nest only to get a drink of water or to have her lunch, or to count the eggs to make sure they were all there. One day the ducklings hatched out. First came Jack, then Cack, then Lack, then Mack, then Knack, and Owack, and Pack, and Quack. Whoa! All those names sound so familiar, or they all sound similar. What is that called? Does anyone know what that's called? When a bunch of words end in the same sound? Good, a rhyme. So all their names rhyme with each other. They're not the same, but they all sound similar. They all end in the same ending. So how many ducklings are there? Should we count again? There's Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Owack, Pack, and Quack. That's 8. So they've got 8 ducklings. So on here it only shows 6, but there's actually 8. Mr. and Mrs. Mallard were bursting with pride. It was a great responsibility, taking care of so many ducklings, and it kept them very busy. Look at how cute they are. One day, Mr. Mallard decided he'd take a trip to see what the rest of the river was like further on. So off he set. I'll meet you in a week in the public garden, he quacked over his shoulder. Take good care of the ducklings. Don't you worry, said Mrs. Mallard. I know all about bringing up children. And she did. She taught them how to swim and dive. Look at them learning how to dive. She taught them how to walk in a line, to come whenever they were called, and to keep a safe distance from bikes and scooters and other things with wheels. When at last she felt perfectly satisfied with them, she said one morning, "Come along, children, follow me." Before you could wink an eyelash, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Owack, Pack, and Quack fell into line just as they had been taught. Mrs. Mallard led the way into the water, and they swam behind her to the opposite bank. There they waded ashore and waddled along until they came to the highway. Mrs. Mallard stepped out to cross the road. Honk, honk, went the horns on the speeding cars. Quack, went Mrs. Mallard as she tumbled back again. Quack, 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 went Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Owack, Pack, and Quack, just as loud as their little quackers could quack. The cars kept speeding by and honking, and Mrs. Mallard and all the ducklings kept on quack, quack, quacking. So, has anyone ever been to Boston before? No? Okay, well, it's a big city. There's a lot of buildings, there's a lot of people, a lot of cars moving around, bikers everywhere. It's just a lot of commotion going on. And the ducklings are just trying to cross the street with their mom, and they're getting honked at because they can't cross. It's too busy. They made such a noise that Michael came running, waving his arms and blowing his whistle. So Michael, the police officer who they made friends with, hears all the commotion. He comes running over. That's so nice of him. He planted himself in the center of the road, raised one hand to stop the traffic, and then beckoned with the other, the way policemen do, for Mrs. Mallard to cross over. As soon as Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings were safe on the other side and on their way down Mount Vernon Street, Michael rushed back to his police booth. Why do we think he's going back to the police booth? What's in a booth? A telephone? Maybe he's going to make a phone call. He called Clancy at the headquarters and said, "There's a family of ducks walking down the street." Clancy said, "Family of what?" "Ducks," yelled Michael. "Send a police car, quick." Meanwhile, Mrs. Mallard had reached the corner bookshop and turned into Charles Street, with Quack, Jack, Cack, Lack, Mack, Knack, Oack, Pack, and Quack, all marching in line behind her. Everyone stared. An old lady from Beacon Hill said, "Isn't it amazing?" And the man who swept the street said, "Well, now ain't that nice?" And when Mrs. Mallard heard them, she was so proud, and she tipped her nose in the air and walked along with a little extra swing in her water. When they came to the corner of Beacon Street, there was a police car with 4 policemen that Clancy had sent from the headquarters. The policemen held back the traffic so Mrs. Mallard and the ducklings could march across the street. So when Michael called, he had called for more policemen to come so that they could help direct traffic so that the ducklings could cross on the busy streets. Right on into the public garden. Inside the gate, they all turned around to say thank you to the policemen. The policemen smiled and waved goodbye. When they reached the pond and swam across to the little island, there was Mr. Mallard waiting for them, just as he had promised. The ducklings liked the new island so much that they decided to live there. All day long, they followed the swan boats and ate peanuts. And when night falls, they swim to their little island and go to sleep. The end. How cute is that? So, were our predictions right? Not exactly, but that's okay. It's fun to make predictions. So, what do you guys think about the book? Did you guys like it? I love it. I love it. It just really makes you think about if you're raising a family, especially of young ducklings or birds. It really makes you think about the things that the ducklings have to think about. They have to think about they need water, they need food. It can't be too noisy or loud. And so in this book, there was a lot of big city streets, which was hard, but they made friends, like the police officers. And so the police officers were able to help them, and they ended up finding a nice, cozy home, right? So did we like it?